So Quakers have this relatively long history that I find just absolutely fascinating. I find it really fascinating, especially under the development of our country and those kind of things. But it was their reputation really that often stood out. There were a couple practices that early Quakers had that, we almost treat as normal now. We don't think much about. One of the early ones was coming up with the idea of standardized pricing. See, for most of the time in the ancient world, and for most of the world, you would go to the market and you'd tell the person how much you're willing to pay, and they'd say how much they were willing to sell it for, and usually there was a gap between you. And then you'd barter until you got it down to some mutually agreed price, and that's how you do it. Well, it wasn't the same price that the person before you paid or the person after you paid. Well, some of the early Quakers, they thought, that seems somehow wrong, that the value of something is treated based on how skilled you are in negotiating with someone else. So they just came up with the idea of a standardized pricing. And the idea that, any child, any adult, anybody could come to their stall or their market or their store and pay the exact same price that everybody else pays, which we take for relative granted now. You don't think about the fact that when you go buy a loaf of bread, you're probably paying the exact same amount as the person in front of you or the person behind you in line. Well, there was another aspect, and they did this. I don't know how they would come up with the value. I've read certain journals where it said, they figured out how much time they spent to make something or other, and all that kind of stuff, and tried to figure out some value. But in any case, just willing to charge the same people or different people the same amount was important to them as a matter of integrity. There was also another thing that early friends did, and that was this idea of a refusal to swear oaths. They wouldn't do it. Now, part of it because they were biblical literalists, and when in Scripture it says, "Do not swear by anything," that they took that literally and said, "Okay, we're not going to do that." But it was born out of this idea of how honest am I really being if I have to promise you that I'm really honest this time? And so they just refused to do it, and they would just say, "Well, we're not going to swear. Well, I'll tell you the truth, as truthful as I am every other time." And that caused a lot of problems in England until they actually passed the Quaker Act, which allowed Quakers to affirm as opposed to swear, to just say, "Yeah, I'll tell the truth." You may notice, or maybe not, but in the United States Constitution, when it talks about oaths, for example, it says the president must swear an oath. It says oath or affirm, based on the early Quaker practice. This comes to tale in one of my favorite stories that I heard. I believe it was by John Puncheon, who has written a number of Quaker books. And he talks about the story where this man comes into the store of a Quaker and says, "How much?" I think it was a plow he was trying to buy. And he asks him, he says, "How much is that plow?" And the Quaker store owner gives some price. And the response of this guy, probably trying to start a bartering process, says, "Well, I swear to God I'd never pay that much." And he goes, "But that's the price. That's what I'm charging. I'm not charging any more or any less. This is what we're charging." Well, probably really frustrated that the normal cultural thing of bartering wasn't happening, he goes out and about and begins to look for other prices, comes to find out it's the best deal he's going to get, so he comes back to buy it, and the Quaker refuses to sell to him because he doesn't want him to break his oath. I find something really kind of awesome about that. But you see, it's these kind of stands and these kind of practices where the early Quakers ended up just getting a reputation for honest and having honesty, having integrity, that probably found its culmination in this. I mean, you've seen it, right? Quaker oats. Now, Quaker oats really had nothing to do with Quakers. Nothing to do at all. They weren't started by Quaker. It wasn't Quaker, that kind of stuff. They just created themselves. They used this picture. And if asked very specifically, because in the early 1900s, they did have an advertising campaign at one point claiming this was William Penn. But if you go to their website today and go in their frequently asked questions, you can find them saying this, that the Quaker man is not an actual person. His image is that of a man dressed in the Quaker garb, chosen because the Quaker faith projected the values of honesty, integrity, purity, and strength. So they just used it because of the reputation. Quaker became synonymous with honest and authentic and real, and so much so that it'd be like calling it honest oats. So they just called it Quaker oats. That reputation I find fascinating. I would even argue that another name for this idea of honesty, integrity, purity, and strength comes from a very important Christian value of just faithfulness. Faithfulness. Simply responding and doing what you say you're going to do. That you say one thing and that your actions reflect that idea. That it is not just a one-time event, but that you steadily, over time, gain this sense of, yes, this is the kind of person, when they say something, it's true. When they say they'll do something, it gets done. It is a long-term loyalty. We've been in this series where we're asking questions to help us examine our faith. That we ask questions of ourselves, we ask questions of God, and we say, what is it that I truly believe? What is it that I truly practice? What is it that I truly value? And simply ask. And in many ways, I could have done this series and probably have done sermons similar where I make it as a statement, said, this is what you should believe, this is what you should practice, this is what you should value. But in many ways, find it much more appealing to just ask the question. It makes you think about it a little bit more. And this morning we're going to be talking about this value of faithfulness. And I think it's important to just even understand what we're talking about. And so the first blank in your outline is I'm going to define, or at least subject, that faithfulness is a gift of trustworthiness. Matter of fact, the word in Greek, pisteuo, that it's used in the New Testament when they use faith is actually also the same word for trust. They're synonyms. Trustworthiness, faithfulness is indeed the same thing. Matter of fact, to have faith in something is to say you trust it. For you to demonstrate over and over faithfulness to the relationships around you is to demonstrate that you are trustworthy. So in many ways, if it's difficult to understand, you can go back and forth. But really, in many ways, as you begin to develop this over long term, there is this reputation to be had. Here's what Proverbs 3 and 4 says. Let love and faithfulness never leave you. Bind them around your neck. Write them on the tablet of your heart. Then you will win favor and a good name in the sight of God and man. Now, certainly it has its rewards. I mean, if you had the reputation of being someone who was trustworthy, of being someone who was faithful to your relationships, that would matter. But I don't think the Bible's trying to make the claim that that's the number one reason. I don't think it's all about your reputation. It's not just about a social standing before people. That social standing, that reputation is a thermometer, is somehow an outcome, a symptom perhaps, of a lifestyle of faithfulness, of being the kind of person that is trustworthy, that values being a trustworthy, faithful, long-term kind of person. I think it's a value that's probably, I don't have to convince you that it's good. I think our culture, probably most of human society, values the idea of trustworthiness. We long for faithful people in our lives. We long for people who, when they say they're going to do something, that they do it. We long to have people that we can trust. We long for people that are steadfast and have integrity and honor. And we would like to be those kind of people. We would like to be the kind of people that when we say something, people say, well, of course it's going to happen because they said it would happen, that they can do so. They can live their lives assuming that when we say something's true, that it's true. That when we say we will do something, it will be done. I think we long for that. I don't think I have to convince us, but I do think there's an inherent challenge in there. that I want to portray by just taking this pattern as we look at the idea of faithfulness. And the first point I just really want to make is about the idea of how faithfulness is indeed a gift. So the next blank is that when we talk about the faithfulness being a gift, it's the gift of faithfulness to others. That's the second blank in your outline. That it matters when you say you're going to do something. That it matters when you give to someone else. Here in Matthew, this is actually the verse I was talking about where Quakers took it literally. Again, you've heard that it was said to the people long ago, do not break your oaths, but fulfill to the Lord the vows you have made. But I tell you, do not swear an oath at all. Either by heaven, this is Jesus speaking, either by heaven, for it is God's throne, or for by earth, for it is the footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not swear by your head. You cannot make even one hair white or black. I mean, ultimately, he's just giving examples of common things that they would swear by. But he's kind of pointing out that you don't really have any say over any of this stuff. You don't have any say over heaven or earth or the city of Jerusalem or any of these kind of things. You don't even have influence over your own head. All you need to do, all you need to say is simply yes or no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one. I mean, catch this. He's making the claim that to swear by anything, apart from just simply letting your yes be yes and your no be no, comes from the evil one. Now, I have to be honest, I'm not entirely sure where Jesus is talking about how the evilness of it, but it seems, at least the rest of it, if I'm going to put it in context, seems to make sense that it's this idea that when you say yes or when you say no, that stands. That anything else, of trying to convince people that your yes really is a yes this time because you really promise or you really will this time, shows that there's something lacking. If your no has to be qualified, no, really, I won't do it, I promise, is somehow suggesting that this time's different because you want to talk your way into something that you've acted your way out of. That you're trying to cover with words what your deeds have shown, or some distrust, I don't know, but that there's something you're trying to convince people of, because really when you just tell them yes, it's not enough. I encourage you to think of it as a gift that you give to people. You know, there's a story. Well, I remember particularly a time when I was in college and I was getting this degree in religion, and my sister, who was in high school at the time, calls me and says, you know, she's kind of writing this paper on some subjects, and it's due in January, and I was actually coming home for Christmas, and she was asking me some questions, and she asked me if I had any books related to the subject, and I said, well, yeah, I do. I have one particularly that might be really helpful for you. And she says, well, can you bring that? I said, yeah, I can bring that with me when I come. I'm sure I'll have plenty of room in my suitcase, in addition to all the dirty clothes that I'll bring for you to wash when I get there. That'll be easy. You think I'm kidding? I actually did. I used to bring nothing but dirty clothes home with me every time. Well, I remember that moment of when I was packing and I thought about the book, and I just decided, you know, chances are she doesn't really need it. She doesn't really even want it. She's probably forgotten it. It'd be kind of silly of me to bring it after all. But sure enough, when I got to Kansas and during that Christmas break, my sister asks, did you bring the book? And I had to say, no. Now, it really didn't matter to me, right? My life kind of continued on without having that book. And she said, it's okay, I'll come up with something else. But she learned something about her brother that day. She learned something that, if I ask you to do this, I better not really count on it. It better not be the only option I have. And it would be easy to just not think about it and dismiss it, but there's a story. I don't know how accurate it is. I don't know that it actually happened, but it's heartbreaking nonetheless. And it's the story of this 15-year-old Joey, whose mom had died early on in his life from complications from alcoholism, the same kind of complications that caused kind of issues for him when he was born. And so he was very delayed developmentally, and as a 15-year-old, he still participated in this kids event that they had at their church every Christmas. See, the idea at Christmas was, they'd have this Christmas thing and they would actually have gifts under a tree up front for each of the kids. And they would have their names on it, and you could come up, and I assume it wasn't a very big thing necessarily, but they could just come up. They would be very excited. The kids looked forward to that at Christmas. And despite the fact that he was 15, he was still encouraged to participate. And sure enough, one year, his name was on the biggest box there. And after everybody else, during the entire service, he couldn't think of anything else, but what could that be? I mean, it's big enough to be a sled. It could be a bike. It could be something huge. And so as all the kids come and get their different gifts and open it and share what they received, he opens this box and just starts crying. Because it's absolutely empty. That somebody had apparently thought it would be a fun idea to take the biggest box and have absolutely nothing in it. And as you imagine how that would have felt for this 15-year-old boy, I suspect that in some ways, maybe not the same emotional outburst, but that's exactly what I did to my sister when I told her I would do something and I didn't do it. That every time we say we will do something, it is a gift that we give to someone. The issue is whether or not we follow through in such a way that there's actually something there after we've done it. Now, I've known people who say that they're so scared of that moment that somebody opens up a gift that they promised and that there's nothing there because they aren't faithful people, that they just refuse to make commitments ever. Oh, I will just never make a commitment. I won't say I will do something. And I don't know, that seems to me to be a spirit that lacks generosity and willing to give a gift to someone else. But that's another sermon. I'm talking now about the times when we do and we make these commitments to one another and we don't follow through and the impact that it has. So ultimately, I would want us that we see as gifts. But I think the challenge in being faithful to other people comes from the fact that our gift of faithfulness to others comes from the gift of faithfulness to ourselves. You see, we talk to ourselves all the time. We tell ourselves things that we're going to do. I'm going to start that diet on Monday. I'm going to be at this place in my life a year from now. I'll get my finances in order later. I will call that friend this week. And we learn over time, I suspect, that when we tell ourselves we're going to do something, to learn to not trust ourselves. Because we aren't nearly as faithful to ourselves as we could be. That we lie to ourselves all the time. I suspect when we use the phrase, when other people are responding to our lack of commitment or our lack of faithfulness, when they see that we don't do something and we respond with the things, but I'm sorry, but I'm only human. I wonder if in part what we're saying when we say that is, really, I'm not being any more dishonest with you than I am with myself. Truthfully, I believe myself when I say I'll do something, but I know I can't be counted on. And I would want to encourage us to begin to learn to trust ourselves, to live up to what we tell ourselves we're going to do, that it matters. You know, in the same way that it can be really negative when we tell somebody we're going to do something, we don't do it. That there's a real positive building kind of thing that happens as we begin to follow through. I mean, just imagine how your life would be different if when you begin to say you're going to do something and you tell yourself, maybe nobody else knows, but you begin to say that, what it would be like if you started to build habit upon habit of just within yourself. That when I say I'm going to do something, I do it. First of all, it might change the promises you make. Maybe you're not going to make as many long-term promises. Well, 2 years from now, I'm going to retire or whatever. But maybe you'll make shorter promises to yourselves. You know, this week I'm going to make a budget. Tomorrow I'm going to make that call. Today I'm going to do this. It may change the kind of promises we make, but then maybe it has an impact on our very character, that we realize we're the kind of person that even when we tell ourselves we'll do something, that it has an impact on how we treat others. But I would like to make the case this morning that our gift of faithfulness to others comes from the gift of faithfulness to ourselves, and ultimately that comes from the gift of faithfulness to God. Now, you might want to suggest that maybe we should instead lump God into the category of others. That we have this idea of being trustworthy in and of ourselves and trustworthy to the others, and God is one of those others and an important other. But really, it's part of, if I can really learn to be faithful to myself, then I could learn to be faithful to God. But I'm suggesting that we're actually looking at the reverse, that it is primarily out of our willingness to be in a relationship and deal with the issue of faithfulness to God that will have an impact on ourselves and others. Because here's the common thread. Really, when we're dealing with other people, if you promise me or tell me you're going to do something, sure, Bill, I'll get this done. I will do this. I'm okay with doing this kind of thing. When you tell me that and it doesn't happen, that I can kind of be like, well, I get it because I'm like that too. I get it that you don't necessarily follow through because I don't follow through all the time. And when I tell myself that, I've obviously have my own experience that I don't follow through, and so the standard really becomes good enough. Am I more faithful than most of the people you are? Can you generally trust me? And we kind of, imagine if we were the kind of culture that just put things off, that didn't do things that we said we were going to do, then the standard of faithfulness is you're just a little bit better than other people. Yet that script gets completely flipped in a relationship with God. If we think about our society where we have these relationships, you love me and I'll love you, and you care for me and I'll care for you, and we make these kind of arrangements, and we expect things out of our friends, and we expect to give things as friends, and we have these kind of relationships, and it is very contingent upon their willingness to continue to be involved, to follow through over the long term. But look what Jesus does that completely flips this script. 2 Timothy 2:11 and 13. Here's a trustworthy saying. If we died with Him, we will also live with Him. So if we died with Him, we'll also live with Him. That idea of if we join Jesus and kind of dying to ourselves, then He is willing to offer that life where we live with Him and live the life that He has for us. This kind of, if we die, we also live. If we endure. If we endure, we will also reign with Him. If we endure the struggles, that we will ultimately gain the prize that He promised. If we disown Him, He will disown us. If we say, God, I want absolutely nothing to do with you, He will honor that and say, fine, you can have nothing to do with me. If we disown Him, He will disown us. If we are faithless, He remains faithful. For He cannot disown Himself. We do this, He does this. We do this, He does this. This kind of quid pro quo. He says certainly there's that aspect, but realize if it's in the middle of our faithfulness and we are not faithful to Him, you would think with this pattern where it should go is if we are faithless, He will be faithless. But it says if we are faithless, He still remains faithful. In your relationship with God, you have the only opportunity you have in the world to be in relationship with someone who is always faithful. To have a connection of someone who will always live up to their promises. Promises like that God will always be with us. Promises that He will always love us. Promises that He will take even the most horrendous evil in your life and He can turn that to good. Promises that He makes. And I understand sometimes in dark times when He makes these promises and we haven't seen the realization of the promises and we hold on to it anyway, saying, well, God will do it eventually, and we don't really have the evidence. What do we look at? And I encourage us to look at the very cross of Christ, who said that we were so worth everything that He was willing to come down here. That He was willing to teach us and lead us and die for us. And while we collectively were murdering Him, He was calling for our forgiveness. Scripture says God knows what we're made of. He knows that our spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. He knows that we don't always live up to our promises, even to Him. He knows this. But He is taking this gamble that says, I want you in relationship with me anyway, knowing what kind of lousy Christian you're going to be. And I think it'll have an impact on you. I think if you know that our relationship is never in question, that you will learn what faithfulness means. And that you can begin to see how I am faithful, and that you can begin to be faithful even to yourself. That you can have an increasing amount of living up to your very word that you give to yourself, because you see how that transforms with God. And then as you do that, you begin to be faithful to other people. That you increase that faithfulness. It seems that's the gamble that God has taken, that He says, I can transform you, and it starts from my very own character of who I am, and that I want you, and I will always be faithful to you, even when you are faithless with me. Now, I don't know if I would design things that way. It really seems to me like it'd be a lot better if God just had this rule, and if you went too far, He was just done with you, and that would sure teach you. But I suspect maybe God might be a little bit smarter than I am. A little bit. And that He believes there is something deep and profound that can happen if we start with our relationship with God and we begin to see how He is faithful to us, and that we respond in giving a gift of faith back to Him that transforms us and then transforms our relationship with others. Do you buy that? Do you value that? I mean, that's ultimately our question. Have I established a good name with God and with others based on my long-term loyalty to those relationships? Have you done so? Would you say your life is a demonstration of that value of having a good reputation with God and with others because of your long-term loyalty? I encourage you as we move to open worship to consider that. Reflect, maybe even speak on that issue. If you've got something that's on your heart, and God puts that on your heart during our open worship, stand up and share with us. I'll close this in a couple minutes.